back, everybody, and I'm pleased to inaugurate the last event of our 2021 Arts and Museums Summit. So at this time, it's my great honor to introduce our keynote response speaker and one of Asia Society's oldest friends and advisors in our contemporary arts work, Apinan Poshyananda, who's the chief executive of the Bangkok Art Biennial. Dr. Poshyananda received an MFA at Edinburgh University and a PhD in art history at Cornell University. He was the guest curator of Asia Society's Traditions, Tensions exhibitions and the Montien Bumba exhibition here in New York, and which traveled to Australia and Taiwan. And Dr. Poshyananda has also curated international exhibitions and lectured across Asia, Europe, Australia, Brazil, and the United States. And as an artist, he's received 3 medals at the National Exhibition of Art in Bangkok and presented solo exhibitions at the Johnson Museum at Cornell University, the Birasi Institute of Art, and the National Gallery of Art in Bangkok. And as a professor at the Chulalongkorn University, he was conferred Outstanding Researcher status by the National Researcher Council in Bangkok and was a recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Fellowship. Poshyananda's books include Modern Art in Thailand from Oxford University Press, Behind Thai Smiles, published by the Office of Contemporary Art and Culture, the Ministry of Culture in Thailand, and Play with Slippery Lubricants, also from the Ministry of Culture, Thailand. He's the permanent secretary and acting minister at the Ministry of Culture, Thailand, and for his cultural contributions, he was granted a knighthood of the Order of the Polar Star from Sweden and the Order of the Star of Italian Solidarity from Italy. He was also made an officer of the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres in France and is the artistic director of the 2022 Bangkok Art Biennial. So Dr. Poshyananda will talk for 30 minutes, addressing the themes and discourse put forth through the course of our summit. And he will also share some of his recommendations on best practices for the future, after which I will join him for 20 minutes of moderated conversation, leaving 10 minutes for audience question and answer session. So without further ado, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Poshyananda. Thank you.
Hello from Bangkok. I'm delighted and honored to be here with you to give the keynote response to the Art and Museum Summit. I've been listening to the presentations which were most thought-provoking and invigorative. So I hope very much we can enjoy this session as well. Professor Spivak spoke in her keynote address of the spectralization of the land and the origin of museality. Under the term musealization, an image is only a substitute for the reality from which the objects were chosen. Museality deals with a specific value which documents reality, but is no way reality itself. In contrast to museology, which is relatively recent in terms of the history of humanity, museality is defined as a specific relation of man to reality. Spivak's acknowledgement of the land, the Anthropocene, the museality, encourages to shift away from museums which are confined within preconception and stereotype of fixed rules and regulations. First slide, please. The first lecture in museological course by Germain Bassin was held at École du Louvre in 1949. The museological milieu seems an abstract speculation in the midst of modern civilization. We witness in museums the evolution of a world that is made without us and around us. École du Louvre aimed to train researchers in the fields of archaeology, art history, anthropology, and classical studies by using collections in the Louvre. Bazin, however, did not mention how these art objects, from classical to modern, came to be the property of the Louvre. In the early days, art museums in the West replicate and compete one another. They were content with colonial practices following white, male, colonial art historical canon and constructed narrative frameworks according to the imperial gaze. Discourse of power and dominance is so deep-rooted that curatorship, art history, and collection reveal significantly the desire to display control and conquer. Next slide, please. Museums are places where Western powers display their cultural treasures. Big city art museums like the Louvre, the British Museum, are quasi-temples and palaces with art and artifacts acquired through various channels, legally and illegally. Most museum narratives prefer not to reveal how precious art pieces came to belong to their institutions. Labels of acquisitions and donations inform only parts of the murky story. Instead, visitors are directed through stage settings of art displays of selected curatorship and connoisseurship. In this slide, you see here the students of Great Britain, mostly brown, tan, yellow, are instructed by their teachers about the Elgin's marbles at the British Museum, how the ancient marbles consisting of portions of the frieze, the metopes, the pediment sculptures were procured and purchased by the British Museum. These are explained on the leaflets. However, information does not include that Elgin sold the entire collection to the British government for £35,000. The dispute on repatriation of the Elgin marbles to Greece remains the hot issue regarding British vandalism, plundering, and looting. Next slide, please. In 1923, André Malraux, the French author who became a national icon and Minister of Cultural Affairs, was caught with his ox-drawn caravan of booty, about 650 kilos of exquisite stone and bronze sculptures, hacked from Bante Saray temples in Cambodia. A trial in Phnom Penh followed, but Malraux was not imprisoned. Such vile act of looting by this French thief was typical of archaeologists with the approval of the French government. To remove large numbers of sacred sculptures from Angkor Wat, many of which now belong to the Musée Guimet in Paris. As the antiquities trade is a shady business, they have become under close scrutiny more than ever. Therefore, calls for decolonized museums must confront issues of post-coloniality, past acquisition, and ownership. Musée Guimet, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Met, all are conscious of these urgent matters, but simply ignore or deflect them with lame excuses. In 2016, the return of the statue head of Hindu deity Harihara from Musée Guimet to Phnom Penh after 130 years are rejoining the looted, decapitated head to the body. For the Cambodian government and the people, it felt like reconnecting the soul meaning the head of the deity, to their national heritage. Such the French government deserve praise for generosity in returning the sacred head to its rightful owner? A few weeks ago, Cambodia is pressing the Metropolitan Museum, New York, to review its collection of Khmer Empire antiquities. Suspicions of over 150 artifacts in the Met's collection were stolen, smuggled, and sold through brokers in Thailand. Next slide, please. Repatriation, the process of returning someone or something to the country or place of origin, may sound empathic and forgiving, especially in context of returning stolen goods to past colonies. Let's imagine for a moment Musée Guimet half empty, not because of the heist of Khmer deities, but the French government's repatriation of these stolen and pilfered artifacts back to Cambodia. Reimagine the blank spaces as voids of guilt, of French atrocities from the time of Emperor Napoleon III to Jacques Chirac. The French have made amends from the past wrongs. Next slide, please. A few months ago, U.S. Home Security investigation led to the return of Thai lintels from Asian Art Museum, San Francisco. After 50 years, HSI announced that the theft and trafficking of cultural artifacts is a tradition as old as the cultures they represent. Returning a nation's precious antiquities promotes U.S. goodwill and foreign governments and citizens, while significantly protecting the world's cultural history and knowledge of past civilizations. Seen here, the Thai Minister of Culture, Ittipon Kunpluem, sprinkled holy water on the returned lintels, announcing that they would be on display at the National Museum in Bangkok. The issue regarding ownership immediately arose as locals from Buriram province, where the lintels were removed, demanded for their local heritage to be returned. With the recent crisis of pandemic, hate speech, racial abuse, and civil rights protests, we find increasing academic discussion demanding to decolonize museums. For instance, recent symposiums on decolonizing, creating, and the museum in Southeast Asia by SOAS, University of London, and the Asian Civilizations Museum Singapore have presented very interesting papers. For example, works by Fred Wilson and Prashya Pintong were discussed in context of the artist's intervention with museum collection, as well as a recent lecture at Arizona State University, the lecture by Alice Proctor entitled Crying in the Gallery. Proctor started her uncomfortable art tours and unauthorized guided tours of the British Museum. In these two examples, we find that many cans of worms, old and new, related to curatorship, artistry, philanthropy, smuggling, looting, and illicit trafficking are being opened and seriously challenged. Next slide, please. Many art museums in Europe and the US are complex entities that often emulate temples and palaces, but never quite succeed. Like stage settings, visitors enact in environment structured around specific conditions and scenarios. The intention of these museums was to remove the artifacts from their original context of ownership and use and insert them into a new environment which provided them with different meanings. Art museums were designed for the rich and not for the paupers. They were constructed as exclusive spaces for the respectable classes. The aura of exclusivity was evident in New York, Boston, and Chicago as immigrants were not welcome in art museums. For example, the Met in New York was relieved that in 1891 the museum did not attract Essex Polish Jews and 39th and 11th Avenue Irish hod carriers in ragged clothing and dilapidated hats. Asians, African, South American immigrants were not expected to enter these privileged spaces. In those days, we cannot imagine Chinese families from East Broadway to visit the Met on Sunday afternoons. Today, the Louvre expands its superior gaze to Abu Dhabi as the privileged Muslim viewers enjoy seeing Hindu and Shiva on display. On the slides here, the slides show the god Shiva, the creator and destroyer, in context of powerlessness, as the god becomes a museum artifact with no context. Likewise, Christ, showing his wound behind glass in Muslim ambience, is far removed from the message of Christ's suffering and sacrifice. Shiva and Christ at the Abu Dhabi Louvre are simply objects that display French cultural hegemony. Next slide, please. Debate on decoloniality and decolonizing curatorial practices is nothing new. As early as 1992, Dr. Vishaka Desai, then the Vice President of the Asia Society, initiated a roundtable discussion with scholars and curators from India, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Australia, UK, and USA. From USA were representatives from MoMA, the Met Walker Art Center. Issues raised were lack of recognition of modern and contemporary art in art history discourse. There were lack of books, curriculums, and teachers. Decolonized practice in museum and curatorial practice were much needed. After two-day debate, the outcome of the seminar was a plan to have a traveling exhibition, which eventually happened in 1996. The exhibition entitled Traditions, Tensions, Contemporary Art from Asia, which I was the guest curator of this exhibition. The show started at the Asia Society, Queen's Museum, Gray Art Gallery in New York, and then traveled to various places, including Vancouver, Perth, and Taipei. In New York, there was a two-day symposium with participants including Geeta Kapoor, Arjuna Padurai, Thomas Machiavelli, Tom Sokolowski, Jim Supangat, Marian Pastorosis, and 27 participating Asian artists in the exhibition. So it was an eye-opener for many American academics, curators, and museums to be introduced to Asian artists and their works. Despite two full-page articles in the New York Times by Holland Cotter, many American critics and scholars really had limited knowledge on contemporary Asian art and were unfamiliar with names such as Nalini Malini, Bhupen Kakar, Ravindra Reddy, Harry Dono, Dadang Kristanto, Montien Bunma, Arya Rajamransuk, Che Chongkwa, Kim Suja, or even Alvin Riamillo. For Traditions Tensions, Agnes Arellano, whose works you see here on the screen, proposed to create sculptures inspired by the Rockefeller collection at the Asia Society. The Buddha seated on the Naga is one of John Rockefeller's Khmer masterpieces collection. Arellano created life-size deities that did not fit comfortably within the canon of museum narratives as she transformed the Buddha and the Naga into images of female deities inspired by mythologies related to Diana of Ephesus, Mebuyan, or the Mexican Mayuel, or the Sicilian Black Virgins. On the left, Vea is a young pregnant mother derived from Hariti, the Indonesian goddess associated with fecundity. Her hand is open in the mudra of generosity. The other holds her nipple. On the right, there is a fantasy self-portrait of Arellano related to Mabuyan, whose multiple breasts is delicious with milk glands. Between her legs is a cobra with open hood erect like a phallus. Her skin turned into inside out like that of a snake in the process of molting. Her arms turn into wings which are folded and clipped. The images were a deification of self, mother, goddess, as the artist Arellano described as repressed and gagged by motherhood. They represent the idea of museum narration where the Buddha is seen as female in the phallocentric society. Arellano not only questioned how the Rockefeller's Buddha came to be placed at the Asia Society on Park Avenue in New York, but disrupted the outdated curatorial display of a once sacred icon turned into artifacts of American philanthropy and colonial desire. Next slide, please. In the exhibition Artists and Empire, Encountering Colonial Legacies, created by Lo Ziwi at the National Gallery Singapore in 2016, was an extension of Tate Britain's exhibition Artists and Empire, Facing Britain's Imperial Past. These two exhibitions are examples of museums' willingness to reconsider their collections in context of post-colonial world and deconstruct the legacies of regional colonial histories. In the exhibition included documentation of performance by the late Lee Wen, the Singaporean artist, who built a platform as part of the AIM, the Art Investigating Monuments Group, that allowed the public to come face to face with the statue of Raffles at the Raffles landing site in Singapore. Originally, the monument was designed to be seen from below, reinforcing a sense of awe and arrogance. By renegotiating narrative framework, Lee Wen allowed people to interact with the statue of Raffles as they climb up scaffolding. A fellow artist, Jason Lim, gave an impromptu performance by throwing his sandals and swearing loudly at Raffles' statue in English and Hokkien dialect. Next slide, please. In the exhibition Thai Charisma, Heritage and Creative Power, which I created in 2016 at the Bangkok Art and Cultural Center, artists were invited to inspect the National Antiquities Collection of the Fine Arts Department in Bangkok. Their selection of artifacts, which have been in storage for decades, were inspirational for their work. Artisanal skills and artist talent, as well as transfer of ancient objects to public display, stirred questions of anonymity and its meaning. Transfer of these museum pieces from storage to exhibition space at Bangkok Art and Cultural Center became a process of intervention whereby these forgotten antique items with inventory labels became once again alive with spiritual offerings, flowers, and incense. The reaction on Thai Charisma exhibition was mixed. Some felt it was an attempt at dismantling systemic structures of Thai museum. Others felt it was challenging for the fine arts department to allow living artists to roam their precious storage and reinterpret museum artifacts trapped and bubble-wrapped in isolated preservation to set their spirits free once again. In conclusion, we may ask the simple questions: can we really decolonize museums by reimagining museum narratives? What is the object of this exercise? Can we really dismantle systemic structures of privilege and the mindsets of colonial desire? In the midst of pandemic variants, collisions of superpowers, environmental disruption, and racism, can we still appreciate the old ways of museum displays of unique, genuine, authentic artifacts? Are museums still eager to receive gifts and bequests from major donors and thereby inheriting and passing on a set of judgments that they may not agree, for instance, with illicit trafficking? Are museums willing to return ancestral remains, heirlooms, shrunken heads, mummies, and human remains to their rightful owners and relatives? These questions will have to be confronted, but at the same time, there are those in the shades of the pale who will continue to resist and ignore such pressing issues. In the future, decolonizing museum may result in display without using a single authentic artifact through digital media, reproduction, and simulacra. With repatriation, many museums will be relying on sculpture plasters and copies of the originals. Less viewers will visit museums as they will go online, and there will be no more so-called blockbuster or mega exhibitions. Consequently, cut downs on budget, cut down on museum staff, curators, restorers, security guards, and even cloakroom staff. Museums and museology, with their short existence on the Anthropocene, will eventually become extinct. Their names and missions will be fossilized among the cabinet of curiosities of species called the human kind.
No, I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Poshyananda, for that very impassioned and powerful presentation. I think you really foregrounded the complexities and problematics of our current moment, and really offered some thought-provoking solutions and directions for the way forward. And I guess I would maybe just start in terms of your relationship with Asia Society that you mentioned, in terms of this convening that our former director and president, Dhaka Desai, had brought together in 1990, I believe it was, and 92.
1992, yeah.
1992, which, produced the iconic exhibition Traditions, Tensions, Contemporary Art from Asia in 1996. And I wonder, for you, did you feel like that was a watershed moment where it was kind of a sloughing off of, or kind of a recontextualizing of agency, I guess, that other, non-Western colleagues in the profession, across the field were able to really take ownership and agency of their own voice, and to kind of, have a rebuke or response to this more colonial and Eurocentric perspective from the art historical canon. If you could maybe just further elaborate your reflections on that moment and how you feel it reverberated.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, Michelle, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm very honored. looking back to 1992, the event, in those days, I mean, it was like very, very early days. I had just finished my PhD at Cornell, returned to Bangkok, and Vishaka invited for a long weekend gathering. Really, I didn't really know what was going on. And, to be among scholars and people who were sharing, my thoughts or my worries regarding artistry, discourse, canon, the lack of space, lack of ability to put ideas across. Because in those days, the curriculum in artistry, especially modern Asia or contemporary Asia, not just in America. In America, it was like non-existent, but also very few in Europe or even in Asia. So in that way, it was like I share these the thoughts of these scholars who come from all over the world to realize that there's a big gap that needs to be filled. So in this way, we share these thoughts, and we feel that Eurocentrism was very much not to be blamed, but to be reckoned with. It was after Magician de la Terre by Jean-Louis Martin at Centre Pompidou, and things were beginning to roll, and the writings were thought to be most necessary, followed by the teaching, of course. And there were few publications, few reference books. So in this way, we thought that we must do something. And the result was 4 years later, the Tradition Central exhibition happened. And I was very honored to be the guest curator. The planning was 3 years. And I really had to travel to these countries stretching from South Korea to Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand. So there were 27 artists, who were selected. And the process of bringing them over to New York, and these were like famous names in their hometowns, but a lot of them were emerging artists also. So in this way, it was like a big step for not just for me, but for the art world in Asia to be able to show to at the time, New York was like the place of contemporary art. But the reaction, like I said, was very mixed. Obviously, people were very, very unfamiliar with the names, and some even asked, are there any contemporary artists in Asia or in Southeast Asia especially? But that was a big challenge. And I thought that the three venues that we put over at Asia Society, we used the whole of the Queen's Museum and the Grey Art Gallery. But more important was the 2-day symposium during the time, with Geeta Kapoor, with Tom McIver. So it's in fact like opening grooves, opening spaces whereby people began to take interest. But the overall effect was like we were very marginal, very peripheral. But when the show traveled, the show traveled to Vancouver, to Perth, and then to Fine Art Museum in Taipei. The traveling exhibition itself lasted about 2.5, 3 years. And, by the end of the show, people were beginning to get interest because of what we showed, and it was like quite novel, to some quite exotic. So in this way, it started this sort of ripple effects, I suppose. And
no, I agree. I mean, I think what I find is such a watershed moment. To your point, it's like, up to then, I feel that many people, in the West felt that, Asian contemporary art is derivative. And I think in Holland Cotter's review, he quotes a colleague of his who dismissively said, there's no contemporary art in India. And so I feel that your work and this exhibition really, while maybe it didn't level the playing field right away, it definitely cleaved a wedge so that there was an opening to then grow, right, and to make inroads through that. So I think it was such a pioneering moment. And I wonder, because people have said, during that period, and I think to your point with the pedagogical frameworks, looking at contemporary Asian art, and just with the dearth of publications, how your work in this space, working on a more global platform, as it were, resonated in Thailand. And so, how did that kind of promote greater agency and, a different perspective of the possibilities for artists and museum professionals in Thailand and in Southeast Asia from
Yeah.
the
So
countries you were working with?
I think that at that time, because although the exhibition did not go to Thailand, uh, it it created, like I mentioned, the desire to look seriously at not just contemporary art in Thailand, but contemporary art in Southeast Asia and within Asia, because many countries at that time looked to the West. They looked to the West, and they did not look sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Their slants did not shift. They looked towards the West. So the beginning of taking interest of the art of your counterparts, your neighbors, began to happen, and it was so enriching that the ideas of gender, the ideas of use of materials, the ideas of rituals, we shared all this, even though different faiths, different religions.
Sure.
But before that, with ASEAN is promoting platform. So a lot of the artworks were very safe, very secure. But then we find out that there's so many artists who are working in the fields that with urgent issues, urgent matters.
Mm-hmm.
So in this way, it created a lot of discussion, and that began to be like bilateral exchanges within the countries. And we must also mention Japan and Australia, who were like important players in the 90s. Japan have been doing it for a while, and then the Australian came with the Asia Pacific Triennial, all these activities, and it related to, at the time, what Paul Keating, Prime Minister of Australia, called push into Asia. Australia was pushing in a way that with economy, with politics, with region, and at the time, sometimes they even call themselves white Asians. So in this way, art became, like in my book, lubricants, whereby art can really have a part to play, because
Yes.
before people just thought that art is just like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Art is just decorative and something superfluous. So in this way, art had a mission, and the Japanese and the Australians came, and then followed by the Europeans and the Americans. So in this way, it was like booming 90s. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I mean, I think that whole kind of biennial circuit, right, with Asia Pacific Triennial and then with Yokohama
Yeah.
Triennial and those kinds of international festivals really made inroads in decentering, you know, art connoisseurship and agency in terms of who has a seat at the table. In a really compelling way. I mean, and I thought I was really struck by the very vivid and visceral way. I mean, and especially that example that you showed of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, of decontextualizing, sacred objects or cultural heritage as kind of an object, or a token of, you know, and a symbol of power, right, and dominance. And I think that really echoes so many of the other speakers in a beautiful way throughout the summit of thinking about sacred objects and, how to kind of give them their life back in a way. I mean, I think Brooke Andrew most eloquently, um, was considering that in panel 2 in terms of indigenous objects that would either be repatriated or, recontextualized in spaces. And I think you also raise a very important point as well about how museums, Western museums in particular, need to really do a lot of soul searching in terms of their, kind of putting your money where your mouth is. If you are going to say, okay, we're going through these exercises of reassessing and being more equitable and inclusive and, kind of decolonizing or reimagining our way forward, but then yet, we want to keep these things, these things can get grandfathered in. Like that's not, that's not really going to do it. So I think going forward, it is going to be a complex way forward and a lot of hard conversations and decisions and, really soul searching to, I think, who somebody said, truth and ethics, to stay true to that kind of moral compass. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how museums can reconcile that.
Yeah. Well, I just want to draw on Professor Spivak's comments, which I love. When she took her mother to the Louvre, her mother had visited the museum in Calcutta, which were designed by the British, of course, and then she came to the Louvre, and then she saw the Nike of Samothrace, and she asked, "What is it doing here?" Because it has no place in her mind, which is rightly so. And then she went to see the Mona Lisa and all that. But the way Professor Spivak pointed out that words and definitions such as decolonization and deconstruction means nothing to the people who she called the muted. Mm-hmm. The farmers, the people who are in the land. So in this way, by pushing that idea, that who are we working towards, mm-hmm. this idea of the museum opening up, and the we, who are the we,
yes,
and who are the people we are working for. So in this way, it's very much like what she said: learn to undo our minds. The museum, because we are at the summit of the art and museum. So the meaning of museums are multifarious. There's so many meanings and so many definitions and so many discrepancies. So in this way, it depends where we are, and the way that we want to point. We not just finger pointing that you're right, you're wrong. We're in this situation, and what I showed in my slides were, what Spivak said, that she's looking at the horrendous future. I just showed you in the slides of the horrendous past, because it's very much that the setting, whether it be British Museum or the Met or the Louvre, it's a setting whereby it's the same. Mm-hmm. It's the sameness of the attempt to make temples and palaces, but they don't actually quite get it there, because they emulate or compete one another. They want their Samothrace, they want their Venuses, they want their, the masters to attract the people, because these sacred objects are treated as artifacts and objects. Mm-hmm. And the curators and the connoisseurs who are responsible only treat them as such. Mm-hmm. And they, the longer they work in these institutions, the more they feel that these objects are theirs. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the we. They are mine, they are ours. So these are the money bringer, bringing the audiences, bringing the masterpieces. So we can sell posters, shopping bags and all that. So to get rid of them, to lose them, is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. So, but in this day and age, where like I said, the history of museology is so small, so short. If you look in terms of the Anthropocene, we are so little, and we will be fossilized. This profession of curatorship and connoisseurship will be fossilized because everything will be digitalized. Everything will be using copies. In the future, with repatriation, probably like the image of the Musée Guimet I showed you.
Yes.
You just have an empty room, and then you just have to imagine, and these empty rooms are equivalent to the voids of guilt. The voids of guilt that you create these temples and they're now empty. And if you want them to be filled, you have to use digital effects to fill in again, because these objects should be returned. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, you could almost push it to say they're sites of violence, or they're kind of records of violence, because this kind of plunder or vanquishing of and then taking the spoils is really such a violent act, and so aggressive. I mean, I wonder, and kind of maybe going back to Dr. Spivak's words from our first session, the concern or the danger of diluting, right, of dilution through the globalized kind of network. And so how do we not become too diluted? And from your perspective, how can we stay focused, and how do we thoughtfully, define who the we is that we, and maybe it's not a monolithic kind of perspective, and it has to be nuanced and adjusted depending where you are and who your regional allies are, and who your audience is and what kind of voice you want. But I mean, how should we work together as a network, and as allies, to not dilute the conversation and to stay focused, evolving towards better practices and greater inclusion?
Yeah. Well, I think, like in 1992 symposium, now we are 2021 and we are the Asia Society, and we are, I think, pushing something, making something happen. So this is a big challenge, but it's a different game now, because we have more people who are listening. The voices are stronger, the voices are more regular, and we're having more companions, as it were, who share the same problems or similar problems. So in this way, we turn to the artists. Tin Kule, Fred Wilson, Michael Cook, Yuki Kihara, all these artists who have their desire to have their message received in such a way, and we should have more symposiums and more exhibitions in such a way that these voices can be heard. But there again, we have to care with the muted. What Spivak said, the muted, because these are the majority of people who are ignored, and how can we, through education, through caring, through more space. Otherwise, it'll be, just another, sexy discourse, whereby, it's a hype, and let's talk about again decolonization. Let's talk about deconstruction, and it becomes elitist and cliquish.
Yeah, and just this empty rhetoric, right? I mean, it just becomes rhetoric then. I mean, and I think one underlying word that kept coming through across the days and across the panels is sustainability. And I think we are starting to touch upon that. And so how can this be sustainable? I mean, I think you're suggesting through continual discourse, through engagement, but, how do we transform these words and these ideas into real action, into actionable change? through, I know you mentioned exhibitions and through, symposium, but how do we outreach to communities that may not want to listen to what we have to say? I mean, how do we deal with that? Because we are all simpatico in this circle of the summit, but how do we do the real kind of inroads into communities that that may be too shy or intimidated to come into this space, or to those that aren't interested? How do we reach them?
Well, I think if you look to the future, the children of the future speak different tongues to ours. They use different technologies. They are more reciprocal. They look at this generation as something in the past, probably, and they have their own agendas, and they have their own, but more willing to receive new ideas. They're not so caged in. They're not so defensive, and these children have learned. They, for the better or for the worse, they went through the trauma of Black Lives Matter, Yellow Lives Matter too, racial abuse. All this, it's about the human actions.
Mm-hmm.
And most recently, on top of that, is the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that this is like after World War III. Things will come back, but come back in such a way that, what do museums matter anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Lives are more important, and even the way we go to museums, our ways of behavior have changed. And like I mentioned, less and less of people will go to museums because they have other ways to appreciate museums without going to museums. Mm-hmm. So in this way, museums have got to change. Otherwise, they will die.
Mm-hmm.
So in this way, it's not just communicating or expanding the population of people who appreciate these issues, but these institutions, which are physically static institutions,
mm-hmm.
Temples of the art, they have to change. Otherwise, Madison Avenue, Park Avenue, all these will be empty mm-hmm. buildings. Yeah.
No, I think that's very apt. Consideration of that. I mean, and that just segued into somebody's question. They said, do you think that the pandemic has been a game changer in reimagining the future of museum landscapes? And I think you have
definitely
answered. Yeah, we really have to shift and pivot in a different direction. Right. Another question from the audience is, Professor Spivak spoke about the link between decolonial practices and neoliberalism, asserting that decolonizing is ideologically imposed by neoliberalism. Would you be interested, this person would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this concept of decolonial practice dictated by neoliberalism?
Well, that's very deep comment by Professor Spivak, because it's like double layers. If it is, by her suggestion, we are being used by the neoliberals. This symposium is about neoliberalism, if it's like that. But I feel that it's not just like that. I feel that, like I said, the definition of colonization or decolonization or neo-colonialism have different meanings. And this is only English, because when you translate it into Hindi, into Thai, it has other meanings. Mm-hmm. For example, Siam or Thailand claims that it's never been colonized. But then we have to talk about crypto-colonialism, self-colonization, for example, that very word in context of Thai is totally different. But I think it's very interesting point that she said that if it's decolonial practices is linked with neoliberalism, it could be, but we have to be careful and be aware of it. And the word is resistance. We have to, like I said, if it's like a new fad, it's a new trend, we must not fall into that trap. Otherwise, we will be back in the same circle, same spot as we.
Sure. I mean, you have to be vigilant, because then it's just like, it's a different name, but it's the same dichotomy, right?
Yes.
Is what you're saying. Yeah.
Mm.
So it's just, colonialization in a different frame.
But what Professor Spivak said, the other words I like very much is human greed. It boils down to human greed. You use any words you like, but I think for many people, decolonization, deconstruction can be big words which need definition. But human greed, people understand, because we all are. we in the species where this is very direct. And greed. Greed means conquer, colonize. I want this, I want that, because it's exotic. I want the spices. I want what comes with the spices. I want slaves. I want sacred objects. I want to decorate my lampshade. All this is like the desire, and it's human greed.
Yeah, I really liked, you had mentioned that earlier about, where was that? You were really talking about this idea of desire, colonial desire, and this idea of empire, and I think that is a very dangerous trap. I mean, and again, you can just substitute the semantics of it, but it is such a base kind of desire that we all have to be mindful of. And I think maybe on the flip side, like, not to be too indulgent either, but just to be vigilant and to keep on that kind of moral compass. Another question somebody had was, where would you place the museum in Berlin, drawing upon the migrant and refugee community to introduce the collections from Iraq and Iran to their own community?
You mean the migrant and the refugee community in Berlin?
Yes. Right? And showing, how would you bring them to their collections of Iraqi and Iranian and Persian artifacts? I guess, how would you recontextualize the material for those refugee communities?
Well, just bringing them in to confront with these artifacts could be very emotional to begin with, I imagine. The trauma also, you mentioned like something like violence, but to see these objects which are no longer there, during the times when the rulers of these countries were owning these objects and how they were acquired or transported. But for those refugees and immigrants who have been traumatized from their countries and living, as the word says itself, migrants and refugees. They are tagged as migrants and refugees. So, and they live in Germany, so when these people are taken to the museums, first of all, they would feel, I imagine, very traumatic, very sad, yearning, and nostalgic. And that could be a healing process at the same time.
Powerful
healing process, something to bring them together. And I was thinking of, in terms of other sacred objects, the heirlooms or corpses or mummies. When these people, I was going to mention the security guards, actually. The security guards, like I showed in the Abu Dhabi Louvre, he could be a Hindu, for example, traveling from India and work in Abu Dhabi. But he could have a very close affection and feeling towards the Shiva. But he had to be muted because his job is security guard. He cannot go and, start praying
and
to
pray
this
to
object.
it.
Yeah. You know what I mean? The profession of who you are, whether you're immigrant or you're security guard, or even your curator or connoisseur or the patron. So we have different roles, how we encounter and react to this object.
Yeah.
So many meanings, even those examples with one object can have many, many meanings.
I mean, that's a fantastic analogy of the security guard, because he probably would be a guest worker. I mean, just using the model of Abu Dhabi, and just, his relationship both personally and, spiritually and culturally is so different than the visitor, the visitor from, coming in that doesn't have that same context. But that it becomes such a sterilized object then. I mean, all of the meaning gets kind of siphoned away, right? Because it's,
Yeah.
And so another question kind of relating to that patronage, museums have varying levels of support for provenance research. So how can we attract board and financial support for this repatriation work or kind of provenance work? Like, how can we get buy-in from these, the guardians of these institutions whose job it is to preserve the collections and to maintain the security of the objects that they're, charged with, they're tasked with, overseeing? How do you get them to understand, the importance of this work, which will probably in the end force them to give the works away that they're paying money to entrust? So how does, I think that's where this person is going.
First of all, I will get rid of all of them. Sorry. No, I'm just saying that you have to, they have their roles, that's why they call them board members. So in this way, they have their roles, so they must be very prestigious. They must be very rich. They must be very important. And that job is to protect. That job is also not just raise money, but hopefully have blockbuster shows, mega shows, so that there'll be lots of income. So in this way, their role have also to change. They have to be aware of, because what I'm saying is that if we have the curators who are very interested to do issues on decolonization, you have in the museums, you have departments, right? Departments of European art, classical art, Asian art, indigenous art. And in reality, these departments compete with one another. They compete for finance, they compete for budget support, especially now. And their jobs are being challenged and threatened. So in this way, they have to compete more and more. And that's the reality. So in this way, the board have to, look after them. But when I gave you at the end of the talk, this horrendous future, the view of the horrendous future is that there are going to be less and less mega shows. And it's going to affect from curators, the people who specialize in, the people who work in the museums, including the cleaners and the security guards, because it's such a big
ecosystem, right?
Yeah, it's just a big institution, and you can't run it physically. You have to dwindle the exhibition, dwindle the collection, and it's like a big challenge. So in this way, returning the works will probably be some of the works anyway. Returning some of the works will probably be the answer.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question for you. I mean, we're veering a little bit off top. Well, maybe not, but just in terms of, I think not that I'm validating their, acquisition of the works in the first place necessarily, but, you know, museums are these supposed to be these nonprofit spaces, these spaces for the public to come and to become educated. I mean, I feel very strongly the mission of museums is to educate, right? And to provide access for all. Um, Although we have talked over the days how that is not always possible unless we change our engagement style. But, um, what about the case where, let's say, a museum who's been having this antiquity on permanent view for, let's say, 20 years or 25 years, and then it gets repatriated, but then it's, being stored in a warehouse where it's hidden away. I mean, then in the ethics of things, where does that fall into play? Like, is it enough where an institution would say, we were wrong, this was taken illegally, we are complicit in that because we took it was in a different moment and the standards have changed, but we have been, good stewards of this object, we are allowing it to be seen. How are your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously we've talked about kind of the sterilization or kind of decontextualization of these objects, but then what if the recourse is then nobody gets to see them and they're not repatriated in the manner, reinstated in the manner that they were originally created for? What happens then, I guess?
Well, they wait until decolonization becomes out of favor as a trend. So that will come back.
You think, yeah, the pendulum, I guess.
Because they're gonna be there. If like you go to all these museums, Musée d'Orsay. We haven't mentioned Musée d'Orsay. At the moment, with all these racial issues and the idea of how the French colonize their colonies, there's one big section in Musée d'Orsay where you see images of Orientalists. Mm-hmm. How the conquerors, how the colonizers look at the conquered. So people may get very offensive, very offensive. You've been talking about the destruction of monuments with examples of Edward Colston and all that. People may be so insulted and hurt and traumatized mm-hmm. at looking at these images at Musée d'Orsay, and they may demand for them to be removed, and mm-hmm. rightly so.
I think that's actually a very good point. I mean, with the Me Too movement, Chuck Close as an example, that, he was really held on this very high pedestal, and then all of these stories came out, and then, or Gauguin, to your example at the d'Orsay, what do you do about that? I mean, and I think Griselda Pollock has a really great essay about Gauguin and kind of the gaze and agency and, subjectivizing people and ideas. So I think that's a really good point, because it isn't just these antiquities that are in question. I think it really opens it up. And so then it's kind of, you really have to think very carefully, like, what is your threshold? Because then everything could be potentially offensive. And so I think we have to be very responsible. I agree, and not go on this crazy witch hunt, and, just be very thoughtful about how we go about this, that it can be sustainable and that we're not going to cut our nose off to spite our face, right? In that way. Well, I wonder then, in terms of going about the methodology of being thoughtful and really kind of thinking things through, there needs to be more diversity of voices, right, within the field, and making sure that people are included so that we can have a discourse and really come to a rigorous consensus if we can. So what would your recommendations be about kind of creating a more inclusive arts infrastructure in terms of, professional development, mentorships, making sure that different communities have a seat at the table as curators or museum directors, or,
Well, again, it depends where this is being taken place. It also comes down to budget, and as well as openness. Some are more open, some are less, and some resist, because I think what we're doing right now, some museums may feel is a threat to them because it's a challenge. It's something that they dislike. It's disruptive. It's about disobedience. It's about going the other way, and there will be divisions, But it depends where the institutions. Having said that, I gave the example of Tate Britain, with that exhibition of Artists and Emperor.
Yes.
To allow that to happen, I think it was healthy in a way that they allow it to happen, and the artists can express themselves. So in this way, if there are more of these exhibitions where institutions allow artists, creative thinkers to enter their museum and enter their exhibitions, or even enter their storage. That in my last slide, it took us, it was so difficult for us to persuade the fine art departments in Bangkok to allow the artists to go into the storage, because storage is prohibited.
Yes.
It's out of bounds because there's so many secrets that have to be kept secret. You know what I mean?
Sure.
We have Cambodian pieces that we are not showing. So in this way, the artists get the chance to see these secrets. So, some other examples are artists are allowed to go into storage and create works in the storage. So for the artists at the moment, if these institutions allow them, it's going to be such an exciting time. It's really invigorating if institutions allow that. Then there's going to be more interest with the audience, because it's going to be so fresh and challenging, but difficult, walking on tightrope, because the reactions of the people who don't want to see such things happen will come naturally. But that's life.
Yeah. No, it's like raising a mirror and maybe not wanting to see what you're going to see in the mirror, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Poshyananda, I think we're out of time, but
Yes.
This has been such an inspirational conversation. I think you've really given us some good directions to move forward, and reminders of, what has come before as a cautionary tale. So I'm so grateful to you, and, it's been such a wonderful opportunity and an honor to have this discussion with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So this concludes our 2021 Arts and Museums Summit. I thank all of the panelists, the keynote speakers, and all of you out there as attendees for taking this ride with us these past 3 days. I think that there are so many important takeaways that I have gleaned from the various panels and discussions. And I really sincerely hope that we can take the ideas and the insights that were shared across these sessions and really begin to put them into practice, and to keep in touch with each other, and to support each other in our collective desire to, continue to evolve our respective artistic practices, and to be more inclusive and engaging, and to stave off that monstrous future that Gayatri is warning us about. But, really, I thank you all again. Keep up the good work, and we will find a way to sustain and to reimagine a better future for all. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing you at Asia Society again soon. Take care.